10. By the end of 1955 there were no $1 million deals yet on the horizon. But for Elvis Presley, singer, and Red West, sidekick, the year had been damn good fun. Elvis's father had signed a contract with disc jockey Bob Neal. Presley was only 20, underage for such an undertaking, and Presley was on the road with pianist, guitarist Scotty Moore, bass player Bill Black, and drummer D.J. Fontana. They were called the Blue Moon Boys of Bob Neal. Red relates, he was a real good old boy, a straight shooter. He seemed to be more in for the fun than the money. He was a pretty funny dude who might have made it as a stand-up comic if he had worked at it. Sometimes Bob would go out and warm up the crowd before Elvis and the boys came 99 on. Young Presley was on the circuit with some pretty heavy names at the time. Hank Snow, Webb Pierce and Eddie Arnold were the top liners of the day. Elvis and another young man by the name of Johnny Cash were coming up fast. Presley put out a second disc called Good Rockin' Tonight, and while it didn't set the country on fire, the writers at Billboard, the music bible of the day, knew how to spell Presley's name without having to ask. The big boys in New York hadn't really heard of him, but Nashville knew who he was, and that was good enough. For the time being, it was just about this time that Elvis Presley made one of the big moves of his life. He quit his job as a truck driver, and from young now on he was Elvis Presley, singer. The Sophisticates in New York and the Sharpies in LA still called country try and western hillbilly music, with a bit of a sneer. But in the South and Southwest, country and western was big bucks. Elvis, in a quiet way, was pretty confident that he was eventually going to make it, says Red. He didn't have any idea how big he was going to make it. All the same, leaving a steady job as a truck driver was a pretty big step. Elvis had plenty of encouragement, but in those days there were hundreds of kids roaming around with guitars looking for the big time. He never said so, but I'm sure he had a lot of second thoughts about taking the big plunge of leaving his job forever. He always worried about having money for his mama and father. Red remembers, however, that the young Presley was pretty much in the circle. He was liked by guys such as Hank Snow, Webb Pierce, Eddie Arnold and Johnny Cash, although, as in any profession, they were very aware of the competition he could present in the future. Above all, we were having fun, and he was a good guy to be with. 99 Typical of the kind of thing they would do was a trip they took to Nashville in 1955. We used to do things on the spur of the moment. Like this time we went to Nashville. We landed there flat broke. At that time there was a very big group known as Mother Maybelle and the Carter sisters. June Carter, then married to Carl Smith, but now happily married to Johnny Cash, was a very sweet southern gal. She always had a big hello for us. She once did a gig somewhere with Elvis, and she said something like, "If ever you're in Nashville, look us up." Well, we took her at her word. When we got to 99 Nashville, somehow we had lost her address. Anyway, we found out where she lived and hitchhiked out to the place. Well, June wasn't home. It sounds terrible today, but in those days things were different. We forced a window and broke into the house. We didn't give a damn. It was a beautiful place. Anyway, we made ourselves at home. First thing that happens is that we get hungry, so I wander into the kitchen to fix us something to eat. The kitchen was fantastic. All around the place were these beautiful copper pans and skillets. Me, being a pans up dumbass, thought they were regular pots, and what I didn't know was they were specially purchased antiques worth a goddamn fortune. Anyway, I cooked some bacon and some eggs in these pans. I can't understand why they suddenly melt. I ruined them completely. We didn't take any notice. We just ate up our food. Well, we got our bellyfuls, and like a couple of bears we then decided to get some sleep. We were dog tired and dirty. Anyway, we go up the staircase of this beautiful house and look for a bed. Well, fully dressed and dirty, we just plop into this big double bed in the master bedroom and go to sleep. We slept like babies all night. Now, June Carter and her sisters were on a gig outside of town, and her husband, Carl Smith, had been somewhere else. Now about 9 the next morning I hear a voice and some movement. June's husband Carl had come home. First he sees the forced window, then he sees the ruined pots and pans in the dirty kitchen. It was like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Who has been breaking into my house? Who has been eating my food? Who has been ruining my kitchen? And now who has been sleeping in my bed? I'm amazed he didn't arm himself with a shotgun. Anyway, he walks in when I'm still asleep. Elvis wakes up and says, "Oh, hi Carl." Now he sees Elvis, but he only sees a big lump under the blankets next to Elvis, and it was me. You couldn't blame a guy if the thought Elvis was in bed with his wife, although June wasn't that kind of gal. But I have a suspicious mind, and I'm thinking, Jesus, maybe he thinks I'm June and maybe he is going to blow my ass off. Very meekly, I just peeked over the sheets and said in a very polite voice, "Hi, Carl." You would have thought he would have chewed us out for breaking in, screwing around in the kitchen and then sleeping in his bed, but he gave us a big hello and laughed. He showed us all around the big house, and that night June and her sisters came home. We had a big get-together, ate a great big southern dinner and stayed up that night singing and harmonizing with them all. I mean, that's the kind of real descent folks they were. They welcomed us like long, lost brothers. You know, I would give anything to go back to those simple, crazy days. Elvis was such a great guy and we got along so well. It was old-fashioned good clean fun. From that night on, Red recalls, young Presley seemed to have a crush on June's younger sister, Anita. You must remember, Elvis is still pretty much of a shy guy. He still ain't no swinger, and whenever Anita Carter is around, he is like a kid with 6 pair of feet. It was kind of cute. Looking back on it, Elvis went to elaborate lengths to get close to the beautiful Anita. Red recalls that a few months later, Presley, together with Scotty Moore, Bill Black and DJ Fontana, were at the Gator Bowl in Florida doing a support for the Carter sisters. The show went over beautifully, and the crowd was eating out of Elvis's hand. At the end of his act, the Carter sisters had gathered on stage ready to follow. Now, says Red, Elvis sees Anita in the wings. Anyway, he comes to the finale and he starts to look very sick. He comes off stage, totters around and collapses right into Anita's arms. They lay him out and he's unconscious. Anita has his head in her lap and she is soothing his forehead. Anyway, we whisk him away to a hospital, and me and Scotty and Bill and DJ are worried as hell. The doctors tell us to go back to the motel and await their word. They would give us a report as soon as they could. We thought that maybe he was dying from some mystery disease. Worried, the boys from Memphis just sat around morosely in their motel room waiting for the worst. At 1 in the morning there was a knock on Red's door. The boys all looked up apprehensively as Red hurried across the room to open it. Damn, man. If it ain't that old son of a bitch Elvis standing there healthier than a herd of cattle, and he is grinning from ear to ear. Not a doggone thing wrong with him. We all pump him full of questions, and he tells us he is now okay. But when the other boys return to their rooms, Elvis makes a confession to me. The whole collapsing routine was just a big act so he get his head on Anita Carter's lap, could get close to this gal he had this crush on. The story of fresh young love didn't end there. About 6 months later, back in Memphis, young Presley and the Carter sisters were again on the same show. The same thing happened, only this time it was Anita who fainted and it was Anita who was faking it. There was nothing wrong with her, either, Red says with a laugh. She just wanted some attention from Elvis. They were both too damn shy to make a move. They never did get together, but it was kind of nice, thinking back. In the show, Business Scene Today, people jump into bed with each other before they know each other's name. We were very old-fashioned, and I guess Elvis was the most old-fashioned of all of us. But you know what? It wasn't bad. It sure didn't stop us from having a whole heap of fun. Later on, we all got a bit too fast and a bit too big for our boots. Bob Neal was doing a good job for Presley and the Blue Moon Boys. His early morning disc jockey show on station WMPS was a valuable promotion machine. The show had a range of about 200 miles, and in the beginning Bob Neal had as big a following as a comic as the Blue Moon Boys did for their music. Often, when shows outside the show's radius would I Want the Blue Moon Boys, Bob would act as agent and promoter but would not always go along. The financial arrangement was that Bob took 10% off the top, and 10% of the take was set aside for advertising and promotion. In those early days the Blue Moon Boys played in gyms, auditoriums, church halls and schoolhouses in towns and hamlets so small that they have since actually disappeared from the map. With the help of Bob Neal's talent as a comic, station WMPS, and some very complimentary notices in Billboard magazine, the Blue Moon Boys were starting to get a wide and solid appeal. After 10% was taken for Bob and 10% was taken for promotion, Elvis got 50% of the remainder. The rest was split among Scotty, Bill and DJ. The back-up musicians were not just pick-upside men. They had a distinctive sound of their own that in the early days was as much a part of the Presley sound as young Presley was himself. The back-up was a much bigger sound than any group of comparable size, but as Presley got more and more confidence, it became obvious that he was the star attraction. As the appeal widened, there were more and more offers to play outside Bob Neal's 200-mile radius, and often Neal would book them from Memphis into Louisiana, Florida, Arkansas and Texas. They would take off on these long trips, the faithful Red as wheelman, and conquer another town. There were times that young Presley would make as much as $200 a week, a giant sum for those hard days. He would buy his clothes, fill up the gas tank, buy a few hamburgers and cokes and put the rest into the Presley household. Red West was along for the ride. He did not draw a single cent. Recalls Red, it didn't matter a hoot in hell to me. I was A for the ride, learning a lot about the business and music and having a hell of a good time. Ironically, Red the driver knew more about the mechanics of music than Elvis Presley. He reads music like a master and since those days has written some best-selling numbers. The burly, auburn-haired Red doesn't look like the average songwriter, football player, bodyguard. Yes, but not a songwriter. Elvis doesn't read a lick of music, and, strangely enough, despite all his jumping around, he's not much of a dancer either, says Red. But he had an uncanny sense of timing when he was singing and a great range, and he would surprise the hell out of me whenever he got on a piano. He's a real natural, just like Sinatra. He knows when a sound is right and he knows when it's wrong better than most conductors. He just has that ear. 99. The more exposure Presley got, the more Gladys Presley worried that her boy would forget about his upbringing and his church. The more widespread his acclaim, the more intense her plea to Red West. Bob, look after my boy. Toward the end of the year, things really started to rev up. While there was still no great Presley impact in New York and Los Angeles, he was fast becoming an idol in the South. Red remembers a date in Florida. We were playing in Orlando, I think, near there anyway. He has really got the audience going nuts and he is playing them like a violin. If he noticed that a particular gesture got squeals and yells, then he would repeat it again and more so each time he did it. Toward the end of the act, it looked like one of those evangelist groups. He knew just when and how to bring them on. Just like one of those hot, gospeling preachers. I remember he was wearing a bright green draped jacket and black pegged pants. He leans over off the stage to kiss a girl's hand, I think. Anyway, she grabbed him and tore the sleeve clean off his jacket. That was the signal, particularly when Elvis played up to this. The next thing we know there are gals on stage and they have gone berserk. It looked like they were trying to eat him up. They were tearing and clawing like animals. Then one of the legs of his pants went. Then his shirt was torn to shreds. It was just scary for me to see what human beings could be driven to. I had always known about the swooning and screaming, but this was incredible. We managed to get him off stage, in shreds. Of course, it was great publicity and the papers picked it up all over the South. When Mrs. Presley heard about it and Elvis called her with his regular telephone call the next day, she was worried sick. Elvis would always minimize the reactions of the crowd and tell his mama that the press was exaggerating. The thing was, the press stories were very accurate. There was madness out there that night. Mrs. Presley became so obsessed with the safety of her boy that she would constantly dream about him at night. There was always something very eerie about the things she would say, Red remembers, like she was psychic or something like it. Whenever we had a particularly wild scene on stage or if a riot broke out, whenever Elvis called her she would somehow have some premonition that someone got out of hand even before reading the newspapers. Now both sides of the family, both Gladys and Vernon, were great dreamers, and both sides of the family had a history of walking in their sleep. Elvis inherited this, and when he wasn't shacked up with a gal, often one of his cousins, Gene Smith or Billy, would sleep with him in case he started sleepwalking. When we were staying in high-rise hotels or motels, we always locked the doors and windows just in case when he was on one of his sleepwalking trips he would go out a window. I tell you this because it always struck me as if there was something really strange about the Presleys. I mean, I believe all this sleepwalking and dreaming were somehow related to some kind of special powers. Something like psychic powers or something I don't really understand or could put my finger on. A lot of that psychic stuff is a lot of bunk, but to some degree I believe in it. Elvis proved it to me again and again. Now, I remember vividly a case in Texarkana, on the border of Texas and Arkansas. We were on a gig there and I think we were driving in a rented Cadillac. Now this must have been about 1955. Anyway, somehow the engine overheated, and in just no time at all the thing went up in flames. It could have been a dangerous situation. Anyway, we could jump out and see the car just burn itself to pieces. The next day, Elvis made a telephone call to his mother, and what happened was scary. She had absolutely no way of knowing what had happened. It wasn't in any newspaper or anything. Nobody knew about it. Apparently at about 2 in the morning she just sat bolt upright in bed, snapped clean out of her sleep. She nudged Vernon awake and said, "I see our boy. He is in a blazing car." When Elvis called that morning, she said, "Oh, thank God, you're all right. I dreamed you were trapped in a blazing car." Elvis said he was all right and nothing had happened. Of course, he would never do anything to worry his mama. Now I was there at the other end of the telephone when that conversation went on, so I know that it was true. After the telephone conversation, Elvis and I looked at each other as if someone had just walked across our graves. It was eerie. Bob Neal, with careful, colorful and promoting, had by this time guided Elvis Presley's very honest career to the point where he would pop in and out of the Billboard popularity poll regularly. The teenagers in the South were screaming for him. It was a vital market, but in those days they still weren't the extremely rich consumer market that they are today. Bob Neal was seeking a wider appeal. He had singled out young Presley from the Blue Moon Boys with the tag "The Hillbilly Cat," which was chosen to attract a wider audience, hence the addition of the Bob word of the day, cat. It was important to convince the big money boys in New York and LA that Presley was not just a hayseed hillbilly singer. He had something more, something new to offer. Apart from his brooding good looks and 3 Southern boys backing him up, what he needed, reasoned Neil, was some national exposure. A big, nationwide television show would be ideal. Bob organized an audition on the Arthur Godfrey Show. It was an exciting chance, and the Hillbilly Cat and the Blue Moon Boys took off for New York amid an air of optimism. This was going to be it, at last, the big time. From now on, no more driving 100 miles to a gymnasium. They were going to sit back and wait for the big offers to roll in. They were going to do the picking and choosing of their gigs. They flew into the cold grayness of New York knowing that as Southerners, they would probably hate the city, but willing to love it. They took one look at New York when they were on the ground and decided they would rather be in a swamp. The Godfrey Show audition team heard them go through their best and biggest routine and then decided that a swamp might be the best place for the Hillbilly Cat and the Blue Moon Boys. They may have been the cat's pajamas in the South, but in big bad New York they were just a bunch of hillbilly horses posteriors. The audition team may have made the biggest mistake of their New York lives. The Hillbilly Cat and the Blue Moon Boys marched back south, beaten into submission by those damn Yankees. The big time, the really big time, was not for Elvis, just yet. If ever the boys were suspicious of Yankees, their suspicions had been confirmed. But, although it was rage and a bitter disappointment, the boys were still at the South. If that's where their fame and fortune were going to be, then so be it. Just about that time, a man named Oscar Davis happened to arrive in Memphis. Davis was a colorful figure in the South. He was helping his boss promote the Southern sensation of the day, Eddie Arnold. Oscar Davis's boss was even more colorful than Oscar himself. His name was Thomas Andrew Parker. Parker was a colonel, of sorts, one of those Southern colonels. He had been given the rank by Governor Clement of Tennessee in 1953. In 1968, Stanley Booth, a talented writer, described Tom Parker in Esquire magazine as a latter, day Barnum out of W.C. Fields by William Burroughs. The description not only accurately fit the bill, it was one that Parker relished and he did everything to encourage its spread. Parker came from the old school of promoting, don't care what they say about you just as long as they spell the name right. I'm a great believer in fate, says Red West. It was just as if Tom Parker and Elvis Presley were born and destined to meet. Tom Parker was and is amazing. With Elvis and him it was like a joint and socket who had been looking for each other. Things were about to take off.